First of all, Baruch Hashem, our Daf Yomi this week is generously sponsored by A.B. and Dawn Pomeranz in commemoration of the first yahrzeit of his beloved mother, Chavi Pomeranz, Chava Rachel Bas Akiva. It's also obviously for the Refuah Shalema of Hinda Bracha Bas Simma Golda and the continued Refuah Shalema of our Chaver Rabbi Yosef ben Sarah Shketa Refuah Shalema. We're holding 2b2 in Shekalim, Daf Beis Amud Beis 2b2 with the words Rabbi Chagai b'Shem Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman, which is the left column on 2b2. So the Gemara says as follows: Rabbi Chagai b'Shem Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman says as follows: Sholosh terumois nemru b'parsha zois. 3 donations, terumas in this case meaning donations, are mentioned in Parshas Kisisa. Terumas adonim, the truma, the donation of the sockets, meaning of the stuff that was needed to put together the Mishkan, which obviously was a one-shot deal. It only happened once in history. U'teruma shkolim, and the truma of the shkolim for the communal offerings of the carbon tzibors. The terumas hamishkan, and donations for the Mishkan itself, for the needs of the Mishkan. The Torah says as follows: Daber b'nei Yisrael v'yikchu li truma. Speak to b'nei Yisrael, and they shall take for me a truma. Zu trumas adonim. This is the donation of the sockets. Me'ez kolish asher yudvenu liboy tikru es shema. See, from every man whose heart will motivate him, you shall take my donation. Zu truma shkolim. This is the truma of the shkolim. That is for the carbon tzibos, for the communal offerings. V'zois ha-truma asher tikhu me'itam zav v'chesef u'nechayshis. That this is the donation you shall take from them, gold, silver, and copper, and so on and so forth. Zu trumas ha-mishkan. This is the truma of the Mishkan, what the Mishkan itself needed. Trumas ha-mishkan l'mishkan. The truma of the Mishkan is for the Mishkan, meaning it's needed for the stuff that the miscellaneous stuff that are needed for the Mishkan. Mar sheyirtzu v'yivo. Whatever they wanted to bring, they can bring. So there were no limitations. If one guy wanted to give $1, that's fine. If another guy wanted to give $10, that's also fine. Terumas shekalim lekarbon. The donations for the shkalim are for the communal carbon carbonis, for the carbon tzibors. Ma sheyirtzu yaviu. Whatever amount they wanted to give, they could give. If they wanted to give $1, good. If they wanted to give $10, they wanted to give $100, good. But yad kulan shava. But in this case, everybody had to be equal. So if they wanted to give $10, everybody had to give $10. If they wanted to give $1, they gave $1. Excuse me. They wanted to give $1. So there was no limitation on what they could give. But the limitation was that everybody had to be equal. Trumas adonim, the one-shot deal of putting together the Mishkan. No, that already is a ha'ashir lo yarbe v'adal lo yamit. The rich shall not give more, the poor shall not give less. They were stuck with the actual machzis hashekel. Everybody gave exactly a machzis hashekel, a half of shekel. If you take a look in the taklin chadatin on the left-hand side of the amud, in the first time when the lines get wide, 1, 2, 3, 4 lines into the beginning of the wide lines, it says the words over here. Avol trumas adonim, but the donation for the sockets, lo yehoya elu b'mei Moshe, were only in the days of Moshe. Va'oz lo yehoya matbeya acheres elu shekel. And at that time, the only currency that existed in the Midbar was the shekel. Therefore, therefore nobody could simply give what they wanted to give. Because the pasuk says, the rich shall not give more. Except for the machzis hashekel. So that's the idea that the Adonim, that was the one-shot deal that would apply only in the Midbar, because that was the original creation of the Mishkan. There, in that case, it has to be the machzis hashekel, because the only thing that was in the Midbar, the only kind of currency that was in the Midbar was the shekel. Very good. We are now on 2B3. 2B3. Having mentioned already right? The Gemara says, even in this pasuk, Nema ba shalosh trumas. Machzis hashekel truma l'Hashem is 1. Yitein trumas Hashem is 2. Losses is trumas Hashem is 3. And again, you break it out in the 3 different ways that we did before: the Adonim, the Mishkan, and of course the Shekalim for the carbon seals. Says the Gemara. Says the Mishnah further. The Chamisha Asabai, on the 15th of Adar, Kainis HaMegillah B'Kirachi. They laying the Megillah in the walled cities that were walled from the time of Yeshua ben Nun. Says the Gemara, Loi Kain Omer Rab Chelboi V'Rav Huna V'Rav B'Shem Rab Chia Rabba. And so Rab Chelboi, Rav Huna and Rav, in the name of Rab Chia the Great, did not say this, that the members of the walled cities from the Chaimes Miyamais Yeshua ben Nun, walled cities from walls from the time of Yeshua ben Nun, can only lane the Megillah on the 15th of Adar, not like the regular cities like we do on the 14th of Adar. Elo, they say, according to Rav Chelboi and company, Hakol Yoitzim Ba'arba also. All people can in fact be Yoitza, the Chiyuv of laning the Megillah on the 14th when everybody else reads, Shehu Zaman Kriyasa. Because this in fact is the right time, it's time for laning. So that even a walled city resident from the time of Yeshua ben Nun, whose real reading time is on the 15th because of Shushan Purim, if he reads it on the 14th, he fulfills his obligation. Says the Gemara, Loi ba elul alamdecho shekol ha-mitzvos and ha-hagis ba'ad ha'sheni. In fact, the Mishnah agrees with Rav Chelboi that in fact that people who live in walled cities, and if they lay the Megillah on the 14th, in fact, are Yaitzer the Chiyuv, and they don't have to relate it on the 15th. Therefore, why does our Mishnah then say the words that seem to be definitive? That on the 15th, they laid on the 15th, they laid the Megillah, those people that come from walled cities. It's only coming to teach us. It's only coming to teach us that all the mitzvahs that are operative in the second Adar are not operative in the first Adar. Meaning that if you do it in the first Adar, it's as if you did nothing. And now you have to bring Matonis Lev Yoinim and Shalach Monos and eat a Suda on the 15th. Nonetheless, if you hear the Megillah on the 14th, you're good to go. Rab Yosi, but it should really switch to Rab Yosi. Rab Yosi, Rab Acha have a Yos. Rab Yosi and Rab Acha was sitting and talking about this halacha of Rab Chelboi and company. Amar Rab Yosef Rab Acha, Loi mistaber l'shava. It's not logical to say that Rab Chelboi was talking about where one read the Megillah on the 14th and then the 15th passed, and now he wants to know, was he Mekayim his mitzvah? Because it passed. It already passed. Obviously, if I lane on the 14th and then the 15th goes by and I happen to be a resident of a walled city and I didn't lane on the 15th, I laned on the 14th, and now it's already the 16th, 17th, or 18th, obviously that's not what he's talking about. Elo rahabo roy. Rather, Rab Chelba is talking about it in the future. A person does not have to read the Megillah, meaning if it's the 14th and he lanes the Megillah and then they tell him, hey, you're a member of a walled city, you're supposed to read it tomorrow on the 15th. He doesn't have to read it anymore on the 15th. Because the truth is, Megillah starts on the 14th, it's good enough. You should lane it on the 15th, but the world is not going to fall apart if you lane it on the 14th. Says the Gemara, but we learned in a Baraisa, in a place where the people have the custom to lane the Megillah both on the 14th and the 15th. We're on 2B number 4, because they are uncertain whether their city had a wall from the time of Yeshua ben Nun. They're not 100% sure, so they cover their bets and they lane both on the 14th when everybody lanes, and they lane the Megillah on the 15th when the people in the walls of Yerushalayim, from the walls of the time of Yeshua ben Nun lane. So, and what do? They should indeed read it for 2 days. But now, according to Rab Chelba, why do they have to read it for 2 days? If they read it on the 14th, they're good to go. They know a person who actually absolutely lives in a city from a wall that was surrounded by a wall from the time of Yeshua ben Nun, a walled city. Nonetheless, if he lanes on the 14th, he doesn't have to lane on the 15th. So if you have a suffix, just lane on the 14th and you're good to go. You don't have to lane again on the 15th. Amalei, Rav Acha said to Rav Yossi, Oif anon svara came. I also think so. I agree with Rav Chelba, and this baraisa is not a problem. Amar Amana, how should we learn this up? The Yos, Rav Acha is correct. This is how it goes. If a walled city resident, somebody lives in a city that is surrounded by a wall, meaning from the times of Yeshua ben Nun, reads the Megillah on the 14th in order to fulfill his obligation to listen to the Megillah, and therefore he did not read it on the 15th, Shema Shaimin Loi. Perhaps we listen to him, we follow his example, and we learn from him that true that we don't even ever have to lane from the 15th. It's good enough to lane on the 14th. But if you do say this, then you're going to uproot the whole idea that those people who live in the cities that are surrounded by walls at the time of Yeshua ben Nun have to lane the Megillah on the 15th, because you're going to completely cancel it. So even Reb Chelba agrees with this, that what? Lechatchila, in the first place, you should lane on the 15th if you're a resident of a walled city. Just bidi ebed. If by accident or for whatever reason you happen to have laned the Megillah on the 14th, it's okay. You mekayim and bidi ebed your yotzim. You don't have to relate. Says the Gemara, 2b4 right hand column. Totally, Rab Shimon ben Gamliel mitzvahs anoheges b'madar sheni, mitzvahs that are operative in adar sheni ein noheges b'rishon, do not apply in the first adar. You have to repeat whatever you do in the first adar. You got to repeat in the second adar. Chutz may hefsid v'tainis shem shavim zeh b'zeh. Hefsid and tainis you're not allowed to do. You're not allowed to hold hespedim and tanesim in Sai on the 14th and 15th of Adar Rishon, just like they're also in Adar Sheni. Just like in Adar Sheni on Purim and Shushan Purim of Adar Sheni. You cannot do hespedim or tanesim, same thing, or you can't fast, same thing in Adar Rishon. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Bo, Rabbi Yomi, Rabbi Shem, Rabbi Simon, Rabbi Shem, Rabbi Shua ben Levi, Rabbi Rabbi Ba and Rabbi Yomi said in the name of Rav, and Rabbi Shimon said in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Levi. Halacha to Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. The halacha is in fact Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel that in fact Sayin Adorishan, Sayin Adosheni, it's also behefsid and tinus on the 14th and 15th of the month. Rabbi Huna, Rabba de Tzipuriyama, Rabbi Huna the Great of the city of Tzipori, Hinig said, Hinig Rabbi Chanina b'Tziporin kahada de Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. Rabbi Chanina had the minhag, had the custom in Tzipori to rule like Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. So says the Gemara, Lo Yoma Ela Hinig. It's Rabbi Huna the Great said that Rabbi Chanina only had a minhag, a custom. Hala halacha loy. He did not, it was not an halacha. But with regard to documents, how you have to write updates on documents, Koisvin Adorishan. During the first Ador, they would write Adorishan. The Ador Sheni Stam, and the second Ador would be just Ador. Why? Because the second Ador is in reality the right Ador. So therefore, that's Ador. So Adorishan, they would deliberately write Adorishan, so they shouldn't call it Shabbat. You wouldn't think that it was essentially another month of Shabbat, that Shabbat has 60 days. Rabbi Yehuda and no, Adorishan. The first Adar was written as Adorishan because Shabbat Adar, so it was Adorishan. Okay, the Stam, we're on Gimel Amid Aleph 3A1. It was written Stam. You didn't have to write Adorishan, you just wrote Adar, because after Shabbat comes Adar. And Adar Sheni Taninon. And during the second Adar, you'd actually write the words Adar Sheni, because in fact it is the extra Adar. Good. We are now on Gimel Amid Aleph 3A1. Misaknin es hadirochim es harechayvos. On the 15th of Adar, they would repair the roads, the streets, Ves mikvahs, hamayim, and the mikvahs. They would clean out the dirt and make sure it has 40 saw. The oisin called tzarchei harabim, and they would attend to all the public needs. Now, obviously, those words oisin called tzarchei harabim are coming to add something to the list, to the specific list that the Mishnah lined out, i.e., repair the roads, the streets, the mikvahs, and all the tzarchei harabim. So says a Baraisa, the Gemara brings a Baraisa. What does it mean by tzarchei harabim? Elohim tzarchei harabim. Done in dine mominus, we're done monetary cases, v'dine nefashis, capital murder cases, dine makos, malchus cases, lashes cases, that means we love him, with somebody living on a lot, upoidin, and we redeem erichin v'charomim v'hekdeshis, the kind of vows, erich vow, which is where the Torah puts a certain value on human beings based on their age, and so you make an erich vow based on I'm going to pay the erich of this person. Charomim is when you make something the property of what do you call it? It becomes the property of the Kohanim or the Beis Hamikdash. Essentially, it's a way you dedicate an object to the Beis Hamikdash, and the Hekdeshis is obviously something that you consecrate, i.e., an animal, etc. Umashkin es hasaita, and we make the saita drink the bitter waters. The sarfin es hapara, we burn the para aduma because we want people to be tar before the shalosh regalim, before they have to start coming up for the pilgrimages. Ruva egla rufa, and we decapitate the egla rufa. Again, that's a murdered son, a person who's found between two cities, and they measure in whichever city it's closest to. They cut the head of an egla rufa by the nachal, and they have to. There's a whole procedure. The rights in Ebed Ivri, and we knock the hole into the ear of the Ebed Ivri of the Hebrew servant, the Hebrew slave that doesn't want to go free. And we matire the mitzvah. Umarfikin is hamino me'al gabe hamoyim, and remove the locks from the waters, from the cisterns of waters. We do not return until the end of the summer, because during the winter, they would create these things. They would lock down the cisterns, which have a hole on the top of it. So when it rained into those cisterns, filling them up with water. Now that the springtime was coming, when it no longer rains, they opened them up so that there should be water again for the regalim, for those who were coming up for the regel, and they wouldn't close it until the end of the summer before the rain season started again, and they began the process again. Now the Mishnah says further. The Gemara brings a Mishnah in Mayit Katan. Tamon Tanina, we learned in the Mishnah over there in Mayit Katan, Mashkin Beisa Shalochin Umitzayin ala Kevaris. We made on Chala Moyed, while we're on it, on Chala Moyed, we're allowed to water an irrigated field, and we're allowed to attend to all public needs, and mark the graves, and mark the Kevarim. The Gemara says, why are they allowed to do that? Didn't we already mark the graves at the 15th of Adar? As part of what our Mishnah said. One of the Tzarchei Arabim is to mark the graves, as our own Mishnah said. So how come we're allowed to do it on Chol Hamoed Pesach? Says the Gemara, 3a2, because you're not allowed to do extra work that's not necessary on Chol Hamoed. So this was already done a month before. On the 15th of Adar, we marked the graves. Why are we marking them again? Says the Gemara 3a2. The siftar, shiyorad shetef shagushamim mishatafu. And the explanation is over here, where a huge rain, a deluge of rain, like the types of rain we get in the summertime of Boca Raton, a huge rain came down and washed the markers away. So even though you did on the 15th of Adar mark the graves, so when Kahanim coming for the regel would not walk over them and become Tomei, nonetheless, if a huge rain happens and the marker washes away, says the Mishnah Mayit Katan, you're allowed to make a marker again, even on Chol Hamoed. So we think, Daddy, we're on 3a2.
3a2.
Daf Gimel Amud Aleph, 3a2.
Okay.
We're up to the next line. And now the Gemara again mentions the Gemara in Mayit Katan, it's the Yoitzin Af ala Kalayim. And Bezdin also sent out people to inspect the fields for Kalayim. So on Chol Hamoed Pesach. Frank, the Gemara, how could you do that? Like Kavar Yotzimei Adar. We already learned that on the 15th of Adar, on the 1st of Adar, they announced, everybody be careful about Kalayim, about two types of grains growing in your field. And on the 15th, Bezin would send out their officials to walk around and rip up the 1 to 24. Again, the ratio is 1 grain against 24 grains of another. If there's such a ratio, they would rip it up. They would rip it up again, and so they would rip it up again. So they already did it on the 15th of Adar. So how come they do it again during Chol Hamoed Pesach? You're not allowed to do extra work on Chol Hamoed. And for the Gemara, Tiftar will explain it. Shahoisa Shana Afelo. We're talking about when the year was late. And the sprouts were not discernible on the 15th of Adar. So this was a case where on the 15th of Adar, they went to take a look and the sprouts weren't really sprouting. And for some reason, they did not make an Adar Sheni. They didn't make an Adar Sheni. Or even if they made an Adar Sheni, and even in Adar Sheni, for whatever reason, it was cloudy, or it was so sunny and there was no rain yet, the rain was delayed, or whatever the reason is, that they did not sprout. So therefore, if they didn't sprout, it wasn't clear what Kalayim was in the fields, what Kalayim is in the fields, Memela, even on Chala Moed takes. You're allowed to go and do the work of pulling up the Kalayim even on Chala Moed. From here, you see something. You could make an argument. Kalayim is a diaraisa, is biblical. Not working on Chala Moed from this Gemara is mashma is only a dirabanan. Because if it was a diaraisa with a diaraisa, you would say the v'samachta b'chagecha, that you have a chiyuv to be misameach all 7 days of Pesach, which includes Chala Moed, which is a mitzvah asay, would be doicha the lois asay of Kalayim. Elamai, you gotta say Kalayim is a diaraisa. Not working on Chala Moed is only a dirabanan. And if you say it's only dirabanan, the diaraisa comes and is oikah the dirabanan of not working on Chala Moed. Having said what I just said, in fact, that's a big machlokes, whether Chala Moed is thing. So we're going to, Mitzvah Hashem, learn the Masechta of Moed Cotton, the small holiday, Moed Cotton, the holiday that's small, and that, of course, is the entire conversation. What is Chala Moed? What are the limitations on work on Chala Moed? And whether it's a biblical in nature or rabbinical in nature. So, just a touch on it right over here. Says the Gemara, Minayin L'tzion, how do you even know that you have to go out of your way to mark the graves? So, Rab Berechya, Rab Yaakov Bar Bas Yaakov, B'Shem Rab Chumya. The Bras Chavrin, so Barachin, Rab Yaakov, the son of Rab Yaakov's daughter, in the name of Rab Chuna of the town of Bar Chavrin. You'll notice over here it says Rab Yaakov Bar Bas Yaakov. Rab Yaakov, the son of the daughter of Yaakov. Why doesn't it mention his father's name? Because his father was not Roi. In a case where the father's not Roi, the mother gets the mention. Also, something that my father said, has told me many a time, that if a person's name is mentioned in Shas, it's because they were Roi to have Gilui, what it called, the Shechina, the Ruach HaKodesh. If they were great people, but they were not Roi to Ruach HaKodesh, if they only say Saba Echad, an old man, or Ploini Echad, or Hai Tana, or this Tana, but they won't mention his name. A name is mentioned only because he was zocheh to have Ruach HaKodesh. Anyways, further, Rabbi Yosi, but it's really Rabbi Yosi. Rabbi Yosi, Amr lo b'shem Rabbi Yaakov bar Acha b'shem Rabbi Chanunya devar Chavrin. Rabbi Chizki Rabbi Uzziel b'rei Chanunya lebei debeis Chavrin b'shem Rabbi Chanunya debeis Chavrin. Okay, whatever they all said regarding a Mitzayra. What does it say? That the Mitzayra must call out into the street, the Tomei Yikra. He has to call out on himself, Tomei. Now, why would the Torah do that? Why would the Torah do that? So that the Torah should call out to you with the mouth, keep away, you don't get Tomei. In other words, just because I'm Tamei doesn't mean you should become Tamei. Your menschlichkeit still has to be here. So for an example, if somebody is not feeling well, his job is not to go to shul because he feels holier than thou. His job is to stay home and not get anybody else sick. That's the proper behavior. So it's the same thing over here. So just like a Mitzayra, who's a Levitic mensch, who's a living person, has to call out and say, Tomei, stay away from me, then certainly a grave, a kever, which gives out Tomei, right? Which gives out Tomas Mace, which makes for 7 days, and you have to be sprinkled with the Meichatas, with the water of the Chatas of the Para Aduma, the 3rd and the 7th day. No, certainly you have to call out. So now, just before we begin the next Gemara on 383, just to remind everybody, Tumas Mace is Maga, if you touch it, Masa, if you carry it, even not directly. So if you have it in a briefcase and you carry the briefcase, you're Tameh. And there's even Heset, which is a subcategory of Masa, meaning you nudge it. You don't even carry the briefcase, you simply nudge the briefcase. And of course, oil, the roof, which means that either you're under a house in which a mace is in, or you're directly on top of a caver that has it on top of it. Okay? That's the short and long of all the halachas. Now we're on 3A3. 3A3. Rabbi Loi b'shem Rab Shmuel bar Nachman, and again, I advise everybody to use the English side. It's certainly easier to read with the eyes. The words are very squeezed together on the daf, and because we keep changing what the words actually say. Rabbi Loi b'shem Rab Shmuel bar Nachman. Rabbi Loi says in the name of Rab Shmuel bar Nachman, V'avru ha'oivrim ba'aretz u'ra etzem odom u'bona etzloi tziyad. Because the pasuk said, and the passerby will traverse the land, and when one sees the bone of a man, he shall build a marker next to it until the buriers bury it in the valley of Gog Hardin. But now, what's important here, it says that he shall make a marker, he shall make a marker next to it, right. Not on it. Not over it, next to it. Etzloi, next to it. Keep that in mind. Etzem, bone, mikan shemetzayin alatzomas. From here that we see, you have to make a marker for the bones, even though the flesh is already decomposed. So here we learn that we make a tzion, we make a stone where somebody was buried. Okay? Odom, mikan shemitzayin al shidro v'hagulgoyles. From here we learn that we make a marker even for the spinal column and the skull of a corpse. Even if it's missing bones and it's not complete, nonetheless, a piece of food.
Rosh binyan and Rosh minyan.
That's exactly right. Rosh, as long as they're there, we put it together. Rosh binyan and Rosh and Rosh minyan. Rosh binyan, most of the structure, and most of the structure and most of the bones. Ubono mikan shemitzayin al gabe eben kivua. From here we see that we make a marker on top of an attached stone. In other words, we pour the lime on a stone that is embedded in the gravesite. So on this the Gemara says, wait a minute. If you say that we make a marker on top of a detached stone, it will also travel and contaminate in another place. People will think that the rolling stone, in other words, the stone that you're putting on top of the stone, that's what you just said, a marker on top of the stone, will think the rolling stone is a gravesite, and will only then burn tumah, truma, and other kachim that come into contact with it. And that's an issa d'oraisa to burn truma and kachim unless they're actually tameh. Here they're not tameh. It's only a marker. So the Gemara says, no, this is what. So what it means is that obviously it needs to be firmly attached to the gravesite. We're going to talk about this in a second. Etzloi, next to, l'marker tahara, in a place of purity, meaning the marker should not be on top of the grave, but close to it. Tzion, a marker. Mikan Tzion. From here we learned about a marker. So now, everybody in your mind's eye, picture our cemeteries. In fact, where we put the tzion, where we put the stone, is not on the grave. It's at the head of the grave. It's after the gravesite. The gravesite is in front of the stone. Exactly as this Gemara just said it. The gravesite is in front of the stone. How do we put down the stone? We cement it in. We bury it in. It's cemented in. It will not move. That's this Gemara. You don't just simply throw something up and let it later on over time fall apart. It is cemented in. Today, especially up here in New Jersey, where many of us are buried, but I saw that even in Long Island they're doing it already. Not only are they putting the marker, okay, at the head, at the tombstone. I'm sorry, that was the English word I was looking for. Thank you. The tombstone. But in fact, they're putting a marble slab over the actual grave site. In New Jersey, they're doing it because New Jersey, by and large, is a swamp area. And what they're doing is making sure that the cave never collapses. So they're putting a cement cover on top of the cave itself with a slab, a marble slab on top of it. Just a marble rectangle.
It's not marble. It's granite.
Oh, granite.
Because marble dissolves in the water.
Oh, so it's granite. Yes.
What do they do? What do they do in New Orleans?
In what? That's a very good question. I've never been there, but New Orleans.
Well, I'm gonna tell you something very interesting. You heard the expression, "I would never touch that with a 10-foot pole," right?
Yes, sure.
That came from New Orleans.
Really? What do you mean?
Yeah, because New Orleans, you're on a water line. They basically do not bury underground.
Really?
There's a mausoleum. So I'm going to tell you how it's done by the non-Jewish, okay?
Right.
There's a mausoleum. There's a big mausoleum, and they put the body in, rolled up, and after a year at the anniversary, they take a 10-foot pole and push whatever remains to the back of this particular mausoleum. That's how the remark came. By the Yidden, I don't know what they're doing right now, but I know they're not buried in the ground.
That is remarkable. I did not know that. Thank you, Jerry. That's a remarkable piece. So I will tell you, we all know that in Eretz Yisrael, back in the times of the Gemara, they buried people in caves, in slots in the mountains. And in fact, they're doing it again because they're running out of space on Har Menuchos and Har Azesim. They are now creating catacombs in the mountains to start burying in the mountains, not in the ground. So that is very fascinating. What I wanted to point out something else is that what we're doing now by putting that granite block, right, rectangle block on top of the caver, may actually work out with regard to tumas oil, because now you're blocking the oil. You're creating a house on top of the grave. By creating a house on top of the grave, you're blocking the tumah from going up. It's very possible that now, obviously it doesn't apply to us because we're all tumas meis, but in halacha, it's an interesting thought to wonder, we may have just solved the problem about tumas meis with regard to kavarim. Interesting stuff. Let's just keep going. Let's see if we can get a little further down this summit at least. Says the Gemara, 3A3 on the right column in towards the bottom. Tani, umotza eben achas mitzuyenes. If one found a single stone marked with lime, even even though we do not keep it so because it's necessary to distance the actual marker from the tumah, right? We don't put the tombstone directly on the mace. Hamahil Olel Tome 3A4. One who forms a roof over the stone is nonetheless contaminated. Why? Ani oimen mace hoya noste tachter. A corpse is placed underneath it, even though normally we say that isn't the case. The marker is always etzlai next to it. We say a single one. We don't know what happened over here. Hayushtayim, but if there are two stones, in other words, stone over here and stone over here. There's a stone in the front, the big stone, the big tombstone, and a footstone on the other side. Okay? So if that's the case, Hamal Aleim Tar, one who forms a roof over either one of these stones is Tar. Ubeneim Tame. Between them they are Tame. Because here you have the footstone, here you have the tombstone. Obviously, the mace is in between the two of them. That's what we're saying here. If there was an indication that plowing between the stones, that somebody plowed in between it, so then we know that no corpse was buried there. Because nobody has the chutzpah to plow where a dead person is buried. Hareihem ki yichidos, they are treated like individual stones. B'neihem tahar, between them it's tar, but al gabeihem tameh, but over them they're tameh. If the ground between the stones are plowed, then the plowed ground is considered tar, and the stones themselves are each two considered to be part of one marking of a grave, and they remain tameh. Tani, we learn, Ein mitzayin alabasa, we do not make a marker on flesh. Shema nisak alabasa, because the flesh may become decomposed and is now less than a shia kezayis, which is the minimum amount of a cord flesh that shall emit tumah through oil. Under these things, if you had a marker, you're going to mislead people into thinking that the tumah is still present, and they might come to burn truma and kachim inappropriately. Rabbi Yusta bar Shoina called boy kamed Ramana. Rabbi Yusta bar Shuma inquired Ramana like nimsa metabe taris l'mafreya. But doesn't it turn out from the sunnah that one contaminates holy food, kodesh food, retroactively, as long as, because look what it said, Shema, maybe nistakel abasa. Maybe the basar will be decomposed. But what happens if the basar, the flesh is not decomposed? Then it is tameh. So now you're confusing people either way. What do you call it? Maybe there's a tameh thing here, and they are tameh, and people you're not allowed to eat for them, and you should burn it. Amalei mutar yiskalkulu by l'shah. It is better that the unwitting passerby be ruined by the unmarked grave for a short while the flesh has not been significantly decomposed, and not ruin it forever. Because how long does it take for the basar to decompose? A day? But after that, there's no more tameh over here. If I make a marker, I protect things for a day. But then I create a misleading situation. Mikan la boli oila. I got to choose between two situations. I picked the one that has a greater benefit. We have another couple of minutes, so let's just start the next Mishnah. Says the Mishnah, Halacha 2. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, very Shina originally, when they went out to inspect on the 15th of Adar, when they went out to inspect the Kalayim to check for the 1 to 24 of different grains, they would simply uproot the other grain and cast it before the farmers, and the farmers were allowed to use it, right? There's no problem with using it, they're just not allowed to grow together.
Yitzchak, as long
Yes.
as it's not, as long as it's not Klei Kerem, If it's flying from the cannon,
right.
then
You
you're not
can't
allowed
use.
to.
Right, we're talking about a field. That's why I was dimly to say we're talking about sprouts. We're
Clay
not talking
Zalon.
clay.
That's clay
Right, right. A vineyard is a completely different ballgame. We're not talking about a vineyard. We're talking about a field. With that, and the Mishnah is talking about a field. It says that in the field they went out to check for the sprouts.
Right.
But once the Oivre Avera proliferated, we're on 3A5. What does that mean? They realized, hey, we don't have to do nothing. Let's plant 2 different grains, and guess what? We'll get free work. Other people will come and pick our grains,
The weeds.
and we have to use it. So then what did they started to do? They uprooted it and threw the Kalayim onto the roads. Okay? They did it and they threw it onto the roads. His kid, and then they said, his skido, but then it got even worse. And they wanted to on, Shayu Mafrik Sada. They went in and they were mafkir. They said your whole field is ownerless. In fact, it doesn't belong to you. Only the Aniyim can come and like locusts take everything out of your field. So don't take advantage of the situation. Says the Gemara, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Tanya, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, originally, they would uproot the Kalayim and cast it before the farmers. And they would rejoice a double joicing. They were thrilled. What do you call it? They got the stuff uprooted and they were allowed to use it. Because the inspectors were weeding their fields for them. They were benefiting from the Kalayim, which they could feed it to their animals. But once everybody started doing this, everybody figured it out. You got a freebie, you're on welfare, right? My father told a story that the first time they started computerizing the bills, so my father got a bunch of tickets. So he went down to downtown Brooklyn to Jerome Street. And there was this guy, and he was laughing on top of his lungs. And my father went to look, and the guy had like $5,000 worth of tickets. So my father said, "What are you laughing?" He said, "Man, I'm on welfare. It's not my problem." So the same thing over here. We don't like people taking advantage of the welfare system. Great story, Daddy. Anyways, so what happened when everybody said, "I'm on welfare"? They would throw the Kalayim onto the roads, and the people will trample. The people and the animals will trample on the stuff, and so that it would become unfit to give for food for the animals. In still, at least they didn't get double simcha, but they had one simcha. Because their fields are at least weeded. The Chazal came along and said, the Hefka, Bezdin, Hefka. Bezdin is making this ownerless, and guess what? It ain't yours anymore. Says the Gemara, Minayin Shehefka, Bezdin, Hefka. How do you know that Bezdin has such power that when Bezdin makes something Hefka, it becomes Hefka? Diksiv, because it says, V'chola shelo yobe l'shloisha sayomim, v'ka'etzem asar v'azekenim, yachem arechusha v'hu yibodo v'kal ha'koilo. For whoever does not come within 3 days as proposed by the princes and the elders, all their property shall be confiscated and shall be separated from the congregation of the exile. This is the case of Ezra and Nehemiah. They came back to Eretz Yisrael and discovered that the Jews that were living there were married to Goyim. And so they said, you got to divorce your wife in order to make them get, and they said, we're going to have a big asifa, and we want everybody showing up. And then they let everybody have it. And the short and long of it was that they said, if you don't show up, we're making everything you own ownerless and anybody else can take it. How do we know that Bezdin Hefker, when something is made Hefker, that the Tvua that's in it is potter from Trumas Maises? You don't have to give Truma and Maisa. Rabbi Yomi bereded Rabbi Yitzchak bar Acha shana min adon. We learn it from this paraisa. Ein ma'arben es hashana. We do not add an extra month of the year. Loy b'shvius, not in the 7th year itself. In other words, not to prolong the year of Shvius from 12 months to 13 months. V'loy b'motzi Shvius, and not in the year after Shvius, because we want to get them to Chodesh. Remember, everybody knows you can't use the old grain until the Omer is brought on the 16th of Nisan. If you push off the 16th of Nisan by an extra month, you make an Adar Sheni, then you're still stuck with the old Tevuah. But the old Tevuah is from when? From Shavuos, which you're not allowed to use, right? So you're making everybody's problems an extra month longer. So says the Gemara, the Im Ivura, but if they did blow it in either one of the years and they made it an Adar Sheni, 3 days, 6, and this is where we're going to stop. I just have to find a spot to stop. What do you call Harei Zemu Beres? It is extended, says the Gemara. Now, the 1 month that the court adds it in the 7th month, is not exempt from tithes. Of course it is. Of course it is. Isn't it like everybody else? Because nothing that grows in the 7th year has to be given Trumas Maisis. But if we say that Hefker Bezdin Hefker is not exempt from Maisa, how could the extra month be considered part of Shemitah? It's made by Bezdin. And if you want to say something made by Bezdin is Mechayiv in Trumas and Maisis, it's not really, it's the 13th month, it's not really part of the 7th year. It should be Mechayiv in Trumas and Maisis. Elamai, from here is a raya that Hefker Bezdin Hefker, that whatever Bezdin does, it's Hefker, and it doesn't have to have Trumas and Maisis. Says the Gemara, Micha Shvius, Motzei Shvius Mai, the next year, which is a regular year, how could you say that? Amir Rabbi Ovon, Shaloi Rabbis Issa Chodosh, because we don't want to have the problem of Chodosh, like I explained before, to get to the new grains. Rab Zera, Mishem, Rabbi Eliezer, Hoda, Da'at Oma, this that you stated that do not add an extra month into the year of Shvius, this is only right. Ad Shaloi Hitte Rebbe Lahavi Yorok, that's before Rebbe HaKadosh permitted the Jews to bring greens from Chutz La'aretz into Eretz Yisrael. Because the problem with that is that the lands of the Chutz La'aretz are considered Tomei. And greens, as you know, wild greens, take some of the clods of ground from Chutz La'aretz. So they didn't want to have it in Eretz Yisrael. But Rebbe said it's too difficult. It's too, what?
Because it's the land outside of it, Yisrael is tumor.
It's tumor, that's what I said.
That's right,
so when the dirt that comes on the bottom of the greens, if you bring it into Eretz Yisrael, you're bringing tumor land into Eretz Yisrael. The Rebbe said that's by the way, only midrabanan, only rabbinical in nature, that tumor. Right. So Rebbe said that's very nice, but you can't do it on Shvius. Shvius, and the year after Shvius, you can't have people starve. They've got to have things to be able to eat. And then she hit the Rebbe Lahavi Yerek Mikutz La'aretz La'aretz, and then bring it the greens from the downs. Who Shvius, who shells Shar Shnei Shvuah. Shvius became like all the other years of the 7-year cycle, and you were allowed to put an Adar Sheni into that year. Tanu Ein Ma'arvin, and the Gemara explains that nowadays why you're allowed to. Right? Goes like this. Amar Ramana, hold the da'at Amar, now that you say.
There if you want.
Right. Amar Ramana, hold the da'at Amar, that you said, that we do not make an extra month. In Shvius is true, but originally when the years were in their natural state, in which case the new crop started growing in Nisan and was fit for consumption by the 16th of that month when you brought the Omer, when the Omer was home. So therefore there was a Chodesh issue, and therefore we didn't add an extra month. But now that the years are not in their natural state after the Churban Bayis, the reality was things changed in the world, and things do not sprout so quickly. It takes more time to sprout. Jerry could talk about this when things sprout in the Negev. Who Shvius, who Shashnei Shavua. The following year, following Shvius, is the same as every other year. Just as the court is allowed to put in an Adar Sheni in any year, even though the sprouting of the new thing doesn't show up too early, so therefore you can do it in the year after Shvius as well. Tani, we learn, shall base Rabbi Gamliel Iburi b'motzi Shvius miyad. The members of Rabbi Gamliel's house did put an extra month in the year that followed Shvius immediately after Shvius ended. Okay, says the Gemara. Okay, says the Gemara. In mihada, your proof of this ruling, which is Rabbi Yomi brought proof that you can that if you make a mistake and you do an ibriyar, you make a month, you make an extra month in the seventh year. In the seventh year, in the Eved, it remains. In other words, once you massacre an extra month, even when you weren't supposed to, it remains. Amar Rabbi Hovin, in minado, if this proved less atos shemam nekrum, you can't derive anything from it, because in fact, it's not this that the Chachamim put in an extra month is not midrabanan, is not rabbinical in nature. It's actually biblical in nature, because it says, Shamar es ha-chodesh ha'aviv, guard the month of spring, of the ripening in Nisan. Shamri she'yaviu b'chedushai, 387, so that it should come out in the month's renewal of the month of Nisan. In other words, Pesach must fall out in Nisan, 387. So therefore, it's the Torah that is authorizing the court to adjust the lunar months so that it would parallel the solar year. So this is by putting in a year. So if that's the case, then Abizai, where do we see Hefka Bezdin Hefka? Then how do you know that Hefka Bezdin Hefka and you don't have to bring Trumas Meiser on a field that Bezdin says is Hefka? Says the Gemara, and with this we're going to end, and we're getting to Halacha 3. It's evident from the Mishnah that says like this: in the case of a pile of Tvua, of which underneath it is leket, has not been gathered. If you remember what leket are sheaves that when you were shearing your field, sheaves, when you were collecting it, fell on the ground. You're not allowed to bend down to pick up those sheaves. You have to leave those sheaves for the poor people. Now you get smart. You say, oh yeah? My workers were very shoddy. They left over 100 sheaves. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to pile upon it a whole bunch of sheaves that we did collect. Right? So now we got the uncollected are underneath the pile, and on top of it is all the piled up. So they'll never So, says the Gemara, says the Mishnah, all the grains that touch the ground belong to the poor. That means the actual leket, and even the ones that you did collect that are not leket, because you piled it up, if they're touching the ground, they now all belong to the ani. Because I can't tell the difference between which leket and the other leket, and which ones are leket and which ones are not leket. Anything touching the ground belongs to the poor people, right? How did they do this? It belongs to the farmer, because the Bezdin said, Hefker Bezdin Hefker. Making anything that touches the ground Hefker, don't get so smart and try to steal leket from the people. The Amar Rabbi said, and now we're on Gimel Amidayz, 3b1, B'Shem Rav Shimon ben Lakish, says in the name of Rav Shimon ben Lakish, the Beis Shammai. This is the opinion of Beis Shammai, who holds that if a person declares his produce ownerless, vis-a-vis the poor only, his declaration is valid. In other words, that if you say something is hefker and you limit the ownerless to only one segment of the population, the poor people. You don't make it universally ownerless. You make it ownerless vis-a-vis the poor people. It's okay. It's a good, what do you call it? It's a good hefker. It's a good declaration of ownerless. So when Bezdin said hefker, Bezdin, hefker with the leket, that all the leket that's all the tfuah that's lying on the ground, whether it's actually leket or not, belongs to the army because of hefker, Bezdin, hefker. They're only doing it for the poor people. That works according to Beis Shammai. But according to Beis Hillel, that doesn't work. He says declaration of ownerless is not allowed to be limited to a specific group. It has to be ownerless to anyone. And therefore, if that's the case, how by the case of leket, which must go to the poor people, how could they make it ownerless? How could they limit it only to the poor people? Aniyim oichin ba'asrin. So according to Beis Hillel, the poor people eat all of that leket, the real leket, plus the sheaves that are lying on the ground, which weren't leket, but what the owner was now penalized. But the poor people will have to tithe. Will have to give trumas and maasros according to Beis Hillel, because that's not a complete hefker. But it's not geneva because Bezdin said you're allowed to take it. It's not stealing, but you have to give trumas and maasros because it's not a real hefker. Because it's only a kenas, and they're allowed to put a kenas, a penalty. Rabbi Yosi, but said Rabbi Yosi, Shamo Shupotam Imaisim Dimrei Akol. But in fact, we learned that this leket is potter from tithing for everybody, even Beis Hillel, Mishum Kinasa, because it's a penalty. In fact, this is what it is. And the idea he's saying is that Hefker Bezdin Hefker, it means it's exempt. Hefker Bezdin Hefker, Alidei HaKinas. Hefker Bezdin Hefker is in fact a rule in Kinas, in penalty. It's a penalty that we put on you, and therefore it's a penalty we're giving. You're penalized, and the Aniyim are off the hook in Gansen. Very good. We're up to our Halacha Gimel on Gimel Amud Beis.